In this video, we'll show you an example on how an administrative distance works when there are multiple routing protocols configured. Now, the administrative distance determines which route to choose when it is learned from multiple routing protocols. This is based on the routing protocol with the lowest administrative distance value assigned. In our environment, we will configure EIGRP along with our RIP routing between R1 and R2 only. First, we need to know what is the administrative distance for RIP and for EIGRP. Well, if you remember from your presentation, RIP uses 120. EIGRP uses 90. Therefore, routes learned via EIGRP should be injected into our routing table for R1 and R2. Let's configure this now and confirm this for you. Before we start, let's look at the routing table in R2. So our environment is already configured for RIP routing. So we see RIP routes for the LAN subnets of R1 and R3, and the WAN subnet between R1 and R3 are injected into our routing table. So we see that there. So once we enable EIGRP between R2 and R1, we're going to see different routes here. They'll be the same networks, but different routes in terms of how it's learned. So what we should see is the 192.168.1 network and the WAN subnet should be EIGRP routes instead of RIP routes. So let's get started. Let's get into our configuration mode and enable our routing process for EIGRP using the autonomous system of 1. And we'll list our networks. So it's configured very similar to RIP. Now let's exit out and let's do the same thing on R1. Go into our config mode and enable the EIGRP routing process. Then we'll list our networks that are connected to our router. And we're finished. Now momentarily though, we see a neighbor being established, which is one of the operations for EIGRP. But to confirm that, we can type in the command show IP EIGRP neighbors. So we do see a neighbor established to R2 with the IP of 10.1.2.2. So now let's go back to R2 and we see a neighbor adjacency established as well, the same message on the console. And let's do a show IP EIGRP neighbor where we see similar results, which is connecting to R1. Now let's do a show IP route. Now we see a very different routing table. For one, we still see our RIP route for our LAN subnet for R3 because that is not configured for EIGRP, only for RIP. So that's why we see that there. However, the LAN subnet for R1 and for the WAN subnet between R1 and R3 is using a different protocol, which shows a D symbol, and D stands for EIGRP. So this proves that between RIP and EIGRP, EIGRP won because it had the smallest or the lowest administrative distance, which is reflected here. This reflects the administrative distance, which is 90 here, and RIP uses 120. So that is part of the route entry that you will see in the routing table. So this confirms and shows you how administrative distances can work in the environment. You can also view the administrative distances, the default administrative distances, using the command show IP protocols. And this will show a summary of all routing protocols configured on the router. So we'll talk about this in other videos here. But here we can see here at the bottom, we see, well, for one, routing protocol is RIP. That is one of the routing protocols. So we see the networks that is advertising. But at the bottom here, it reflects the distance, the administrative distance, which is 112 or 20. And we see EIGRP configured. And at the bottom of that command, you will see the administrative distance where internal routes is 90, but external routes is 170. So this is how you can also view the administrative distance for routing protocols.